In the final months of the Second World War, long after the world had learned of concentration camps like Auschwitz and Dachau, a quieter horror was unfolding across the collapsing Nazi empire. As Allied forces closed in from both east and west, tens of thousands of prisoners, starved, sick, and barely alive, were forced to march for hundreds of kilometers with no clear destination. Many never made it. Those who did often arrived at one final devastating place: Bergen-Belsen. We often think of the Holocaust in terms of railways and gas chambers, but what happens when the trains stop running and the camps are dismantled in haste? What happens when genocide is forced onto the road? This is the story of the death marches that led to and through the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp during the last brutal phase of Nazi Germany. In the dense forests of Lower Saxony in northern Germany, not far from the town of Celle, a military compound began to take shape in the early years of the Second World War. It was 1940, and Germany was expanding its war effort across Europe. The site was called Bergen-Belsen. At first glance, it appeared to be one of many utilitarian facilities established by the German army during its campaigns. Its original purpose was relatively straightforward. It was a prisoner-of-war camp intended for captured soldiers from the Western Front. The camp initially held Belgian and French prisoners, later joined by Soviet captives as Germany's military pushed eastward. Under the Geneva Conventions, prisoner-of-war camps were supposed to follow certain standards. In practice, the treatment of prisoners varied greatly depending on their nationality and perceived racial status. While Western European prisoners were usually granted some protection, Soviet POWs suffered from deliberate neglect and abuse. Many of them died from starvation, illness, or exposure. As the war progressed, the Nazi state began to reconfigure its detention infrastructure. The purpose of Bergen-Belsen shifted dramatically over time. In 1943, the camp was transferred from the control of the Wehrmacht, the regular German army, to the SS, the paramilitary organization responsible for enforcing Nazi racial policies. This transfer marked the beginning of Bergen-Belsen's transformation from a military detention center into part of the broader concentration camp system. The SS did not immediately convert the camp into an extermination site like Auschwitz or Treblinka. Instead, Bergen-Belsen was designated as a detention camp or Aufnahmelager for so-called exchange Jews, a term used by the Nazis for Jewish prisoners who might be traded for German nationals held abroad. The idea was to create a pool of hostages who could be used as bargaining chips with Allied governments. In this early phase, the camp's population was limited, and conditions were marginally better than in the death camps of occupied Poland. However, this plan was more theoretical than practical. Very few prisoners were actually exchanged. The number of detainees continued to grow, and the camp began to receive Jews from across Europe, particularly from Hungary, Poland, and the Netherlands. As the Nazi regime expanded its network of terror, Bergen-Belsen evolved into a holding camp for those who had survived ghettos, forced labor, or transfers from other camps. By the end of 1944, the character of the camp had changed entirely. It was now part of the machinery of the Holocaust. The shift was driven by events beyond the camp's barbed wire fences. In the east, the Soviet Red Army was advancing steadily through Nazi-occupied territory. As they approached major extermination centers like Majdanek and Auschwitz, the SS began evacuating these sites, sending surviving prisoners westward. Bergen-Belsen was one of the destinations. The camp quickly became overwhelmed. Originally built to hold a few thousand people, it now housed tens of thousands, most of them in overcrowded barracks or tents with no heating, sanitation, or sufficient food. Hunger, disease, and despair spread rapidly. Bergen-Belsen never had gas chambers, but this did not make it any less deadly. Conditions deteriorated so badly that mass death became inevitable. In place of industrialized extermination, the Nazis relied on systematic neglect. Starvation and typhus became the primary causes of death, but this too was by design. The SS refused to provide adequate food or medicine and denied access to outside aid. In late 1944, Adolf Haas, the camp's first SS commandant, was replaced by Josef Kramer, who had previously served at Auschwitz. His arrival marked a turning point. Kramer brought with him a reputation for cruelty and a strict adherence to Nazi ideology. He implemented tighter control over the prisoners, enforced harsher discipline, and refused all appeals for humanitarian assistance, even as the death toll began to climb into the thousands each week. As commandant, Kramer oversaw the arrival of transports from other camps being cleared out by the SS. Among those who arrived were women and children, many already sick or near death. There was no quarantine, no medical care, no plan to accommodate them. They were simply absorbed into the chaos. Witnesses from this period recall the camp as a place where death was constant and meaningless. Survivors described stepping over bodies to reach food distribution points, watching as guards ignored cries for help, and sleeping beside corpses for lack of space. As one survivor later said, "The living and the dead shared the same ground. There was no difference anymore." What made Bergen-Belsen uniquely horrifying was that it was not a remote extermination camp hidden in the Polish countryside. It was located in Germany itself, near towns and rail lines, within view of civilians. Yet the suffering inside its fences remained largely invisible to the outside world. This invisibility was intentional. The Nazis maintained tight control over information, and even as the situation inside the camp spiraled out of control, they continued to deny access to international observers. Efforts by the International Red Cross to intervene were blocked or delayed. Reports that did emerge were often dismissed as exaggerations or wartime propaganda. But for those inside Bergen-Belsen, the suffering was very real. By the spring of 1945, the camp had become a human catastrophe. Tens of thousands had died, and thousands more were arriving each week from across the disintegrating Nazi empire. These new arrivals came on foot, forced to march for days or weeks without food or shelter. They came from other camps, Auschwitz, Neuengamme, Dora Mittelbau, and they brought with them the diseases and trauma of long-term imprisonment. These were the so-called death marches, forced evacuations carried out by the SS as the Allies approached from all sides. Bergen-Belsen became both a destination and a dumping ground for these broken survivors. By late 1944, Nazi Germany stood on the edge of military defeat. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army was advancing with overwhelming force, breaking through German lines and liberating swathes of occupied territory. The Nazi dream of a thousand-year Reich was unraveling, not only on the battlefield, but across the network of camps it had built to carry out the Holocaust. The collapse of the front lines brought chaos to the system of forced labor and extermination that had stretched across much of Eastern and Central Europe. Camps like Majdanek and Auschwitz, which had once served as centers of mass killing, were now vulnerable. The Nazis, unwilling to let prisoners fall into enemy hands, began to implement a policy of evacuation, one that would come to define the final phase of the Holocaust. These evacuations were neither organized nor humane. Instead, they took the form of forced marches over long distances through snow, ice, and mud. Prisoners were pulled from their bunks and herded out into the winter, often with little more than the clothes on their backs. There was no food prepared for the journey, no medical care, no shelter. The SS guards who accompanied the prisoners had clear instructions: keep the column moving. Those who could not walk, whether from illness, injury, or exhaustion, were to be left behind or shot. This strategy was not improvised. It followed a directive from Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, who ordered that concentration camps in the east be evacuated before they could be reached by the Red Army. The goal was to prevent survivors from testifying to the crimes committed there, to destroy evidence of genocide, and to continue exploiting forced labor wherever possible. In January of 1945, as Soviet forces approached Auschwitz, the camp was evacuated under these orders. Approximately 56,000 prisoners were forced to leave on foot, many in sub-zero temperatures. They were divided into groups and marched toward camps in Germany and Austria. Bergen-Belsen became one of the key destinations in this exodus. The conditions of these marches were often fatal. Prisoners were already emaciated from years of starvation. They were weakened by forced labor, disease, and psychological trauma. Many wore no shoes. Some were barefoot in deep snow. If someone fell behind or collapsed, they were executed on the spot. Those still walking were forced to step around the bodies of their fellow inmates. For the SS guards, these were not simply logistical movements, they were mobile extensions of the death camps themselves. The brutality displayed during the marches was consistent with the dehumanization that had defined the entire Nazi system. Killing was casual and frequent. Eyewitnesses later described how guards would shoot prisoners simply for stumbling or speaking out of turn. Despite these conditions, the evacuations continued across the eastern territories. From camps like Stutthof, Gross-Rosen and Sachsenhausen, similar columns of prisoners began their journeys westward. Some marches lasted for weeks. Others ended in mass shootings when the SS feared they would be overtaken by Allied forces. As prisoners arrived in western camps like Bergen-Belsen, the system that had once managed their imprisonment began to collapse under its own weight. Bergen-Belsen had not been designed to handle such numbers. The barracks were already overcrowded, the food supply was minimal, and sanitation was non-existent. Now, with thousands more arriving daily from death marches, the camp descended into a humanitarian disaster. Many of these new arrivals were women and children, sent west from the women's camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Entire families had already been separated, and those who reached Bergen-Belsen were rarely intact units. They arrived with frost-bitten limbs, open wounds, and lice-infested clothes. Typhus, which thrives in such conditions, spread rapidly. The SS made no attempt to contain it. The influx of prisoners also strained the guards themselves. Some camps in the east had relied on large SS contingents to manage operations. As the number of camps contracted, fewer personnel were assigned to oversee larger and more desperate populations. This lack of control led to even harsher discipline. Beatings, shootings, and random punishments became common, not as official policy but as expressions of power and frustration by overburdened guards. The Nazi leadership, even in the face of total military defeat, refused to abandon its racial goals. This is one of the most revealing aspects of the death marches. Rather than conserve resources for the war effort or negotiate surrender, they committed manpower, transportation, and time to transferring prisoners, most of whom could no longer contribute to forced labor. The ideological hatred of Jews, Roma, and other persecuted groups remained a driving force even as Germany burned. As the front lines moved westward, the disconnect between military reality and ideological obsession grew. Some SS units believed they were delaying the inevitable. Others saw the death marches as a last opportunity to complete the destruction of the Jews. For the prisoners, the result was the same: continued suffering with no end in sight. The death marches also passed through civilian areas. Towns and villages across Eastern and Central Europe bore witness to these human caravans. Local residents watched as skeletal figures trudged past, escorted by armed guards. Some offered food or water at great personal risk. Others turned away. A few reported the marches to authorities or participated in abuses. These encounters would haunt post-war memory and raise lasting questions about complicity and silence. Despite the cruelty, acts of resistance did occur. Some prisoners escaped during the marches, slipping into forests or hiding with sympathetic villagers. A few were rescued by advancing Allied forces. Others banded together to support the weakest among them, sharing scraps of food or helping those who could no longer walk. In these moments, even amid horror, traces of solidarity and humanity survived. As Bergen-Belsen received more transports from the east, its role in the Nazi system changed again. It was no longer just a detention camp or a holding facility. It became a terminal point, a place where the survivors of other camps were sent to die slowly rather than be killed outright. The death marches funneled victims from collapsing extermination centers into a new kind of death zone. Bergen-Belsen became, in effect, the end of the road. By early spring of 1945, the landscape of Nazi Germany was unrecognizable. The Allied forces were closing in from all directions. American and British troops were pushing through the west. The Soviets were nearing Berlin from the east. The death marches continued even as German towns fell one after another. Bergen-Belsen, now packed with tens of thousands of prisoners, stood at the center of this collapse. As the winter of late 1944 settled over Eastern and Central Europe, a deadly rhythm took hold across the retreating Nazi camp system. The death marches, which had begun as frantic evacuations, evolved into a pattern of deliberate cruelty. With snow covering the ground, temperatures falling well below freezing, and the Eastern Front collapsing more rapidly than ever, prisoners were forced from their barracks and into the cold wilderness, often with no clear destination, only orders to move westward. For many, this winter would be their final journey. The first large-scale death marches from Auschwitz began in January of 1945, but smaller columns had already been set in motion in the final months of the previous year. These early evacuations established the brutal logic that would define what followed. Move the prisoners, no matter their condition. Execute those who cannot keep pace, and deny all aid, rest, or protection. The term death march would not have existed at the time, but survivors would later use it to describe a process that combined starvation, exposure, exhaustion, and violence into a single mechanism of extermination. The distances involved were staggering. Prisoners were sometimes marched over 200 kilometers or more, through thick forests, frozen roads, and abandoned villages. At night, there were no blankets or shelter, just open fields or makeshift barns, if any shelter existed at all. Many prisoners marched without shoes, their feet wrapped in rags or simply bare against the snow and ice. Frostbite became a common cause of death. The lack of food meant that the prisoners burned through the last of their strength within days. One of the defining features of these early marches was the sheer randomness of death. People were not selected for execution based on resistance or disobedience. They were shot for slowing down, for stumbling, for coughing too loudly, or simply for no reason at all. Guards, many of them young and poorly trained, acted with almost complete impunity. Prisoners understood quickly that survival depended on staying invisible, neither too weak nor too noticeable. Among the most harrowing routes were those leading toward Bergen-Belsen. Prisoners from camps such as Stutthof, Dora Mittelbau, and Gross Rosen were directed toward what was then still seen as a holding camp. In practice, however, Bergen-Belsen had already begun to take on its final form, as a death camp through neglect and overcrowding. Survivors who arrived after weeks on the road found little refuge. The journey did not end at the camp gates. In many cases, it simply transitioned into another phase of suffering. The human cost of these marches is difficult to calculate with precision. Records were poorly kept, often deliberately destroyed. Eyewitness accounts suggest that tens of thousands died en route during the winter months alone. In some cases, entire columns disappeared, massacred in forests, buried in snowdrifts, or simply abandoned by their guards when Allied forces drew near. The marches also included significant numbers of women and children. In earlier phases of the Holocaust, many women and children had been murdered upon arrival at extermination camps. But by late 1944, the shifting priorities of the Nazis, especially the need for forced labor and the logistics of evacuation, meant that even the most vulnerable were not spared the ordeal of the death marches. Pregnant women, young girls, and elderly women were among those forced to walk for days without food or rest. Personal testimonies from this period provide chilling detail. Hannah Levy-Haas, a Jewish teacher and Yugoslav partisan imprisoned in Bergen-Belsen, kept a secret diary during her time in the camp. Although she did not describe a death march firsthand, she documented the arrival of new transports in the dead of winter, people who had clearly come from long treks, arriving with blackened feet, open sores, and vacant eyes. She wrote, "They no longer speak, they no longer cry, they fall where they stand." One of the most disturbing aspects of the death marches was how quickly they became normalized within the crumbling Nazi system. Orders to evacuate prisoners were issued with bureaucratic efficiency. Train transport was increasingly limited due to Allied bombings and destroyed infrastructure, so marches were treated as a logistical solution. The fact that thousands would die along the way was not a flaw in the system, it was part of the system. While the SS controlled the marches, local German authorities and civilians were often aware of their passage. Columns of emaciated prisoners passed through towns and villages. Sometimes local people offered water or bread. In other cases, they turned away in silence or even reported escapees to the authorities. A few took greater risks, hiding fugitives or warning them of approaching patrols. But such acts were rare. Fear of punishment, often death for aiding Jews, was enough to keep most people at a distance. The guards assigned to these marches varied in background. Some were career SS men, hardened by years of service in concentration camps. Others were recently conscripted, including older men or even teenagers from the Volkssturm, Germany's last-ditch militia. There were also women guards, particularly on marches involving female prisoners. Irma Graeser, later tried and executed for war crimes, was one such figure, known for her cruelty at both Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. For many guards, the marches provided a context in which ordinary restraints were suspended. In the absence of oversight, they could act with total authority. The power to kill became casual, and this casualness was part of the horror. When prisoners tried to assist one another, sharing food, helping someone who had fallen, guards often responded with beatings or executions. Despite the horror, there were moments of resistance and humanity. Prisoners formed small groups for mutual support. They whispered encouragement to each other, shared water gathered from ditches, or devised codes to warn about approaching guards. Some prisoners attempted to escape during snowstorms or at night, hoping that the chaos of the marches would give them a better chance than the heavily guarded camps ever had. A few succeeded, reaching nearby farms or hiding in forests until liberation. Most were recaptured or killed. As more columns moved westward, Bergen-Belsen began to transform in both size and function. The camp, which had already seen a sharp increase in population, now faced an influx of thousands more, many of them barely alive. By the end of the winter, the camp held tens of thousands, far beyond its capacity. Disease spread unchecked. There was no food reserve, no functioning medical system, and no plan for handling the dead. The impact of these first waves of death marches went beyond the immediate suffering. They marked the beginning of a final phase in Nazi policy, a phase in which death was no longer confined to camp infrastructure, but extended across the landscape of Europe. The roads, fields, and forests became part of the killing ground. Bergen-Belsen was no longer just a destination. It was a node in a moving system of extermination. As the machinery of the Nazi state faltered under the weight of military defeat and internal collapse, Bergen-Belsen entered its most horrific phase. This was not solely the result of external pressures. It was shaped directly by those in command, individuals whose actions, or willful inactions, determined whether thousands would live or die. One of the most notorious among them was Josef Kramer, who assumed control of Bergen-Belsen in December of 1944. Kramer was no stranger to the operations of Nazi concentration camps. Born in the early years of the 20th century in Munich, he had joined the SS in the 1930s and quickly climbed the ranks of the concentration camp system. His prior posts included leadership roles at Dachau, Natzweiler-Struthof in France, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. By the time he arrived at Bergen-Belsen, Kramer had already overseen mass killings and selections for the gas chambers. His experience made him a valuable asset to the SS hierarchy, and a symbol of the system's calculated cruelty. But Bergen-Belsen was different from Auschwitz. It had no crematoria, no gas chambers, no fixed extermination apparatus. Its deadliest feature was neglect. Kramer's task was not to oversee mass executions, but to maintain order in a camp rapidly filling with dying prisoners, many of whom had survived death marches only to find themselves trapped in new suffering. Under Kramer's command, conditions in Bergen-Belsen deteriorated at an astonishing pace. By the end of December, the camp held over 15,000 inmates. Just 3 months later, that number would surpass 60,000. The infrastructure, never designed to handle such numbers, collapsed. Water pumps failed, latrines overflowed, food deliveries stopped arriving. Kramer, fully aware of the situation, chose not to act. Reports indicate that he received repeated warnings from camp doctors and even some lower-ranking SS personnel about the risk of epidemic. Typhus, spread by lice and worsened by overcrowding, was beginning to kill hundreds each week. Kramer refused to quarantine infected prisoners or improve sanitation. When international organizations such as the Swedish Red Cross offered aid, they were turned away or stalled by bureaucracy. His decisions, or deliberate refusals to make them, transformed Bergen-Belsen into a cesspool of disease and despair. One British medical officer who arrived after the camp's liberation later described it as the world's largest mass of human misery. Kramer was not absent during this period. He remained a visible figure in the camp, inspecting barracks, walking among the prisoners and enforcing rules. He simply chose not to intervene. For many survivors, Kramer's indifference was as terrifying as any act of violence. His calm demeanor, his precise records, his willingness to follow orders without question, all these contributed to the horror. He did not shout or beat prisoners himself. He delegated those tasks to guards. His cruelty lay in treating mass death as a logistical problem, one he preferred not to solve. Kramer's actions were not isolated. He worked alongside a cadre of SS guards and female overseers, many of whom became infamous in their own right. Among them was Irma Gräser, a former guard from Auschwitz who, despite her young age, had already developed a reputation for sadism. At Bergen-Belsen, she oversaw female prisoners, often beating them with whips or unleashing dogs on those who failed to obey. Other guards used their power to withhold food or distribute it only in exchange for degrading behavior. The camp administration continued to receive new arrivals, most of whom were sent on from other camps being evacuated. Trains delivered the barely living to a facility with no functioning medical care, no food stores, and no shelter. Kramer accepted these transports without protest, knowing full well that most of the new arrivals would die within days. By February of 1945, death had become the defining feature of Bergen-Belsen. Corpses were left in the open, piling up between barracks or tossed into shallow pits. With no wood available, burials became rare. The stench of rotting bodies mixed with the acrid smoke of garbage fires and the filth of overflowing sewage. Children lay beside their dead mothers. The sick, delirious with fever, wandered aimlessly until they too collapsed. Yet Kramer maintained a strict regime within this chaos. Prisoners were still forced to stand in roll calls for hours, even in freezing rain. Attempts to seek medical help or plead for food were punished. Inmates were beaten for stepping outside designated areas. It was a system that had ceased to function in any rational sense, but whose rules were enforced with mechanical precision. A small number of German civilians living near the camp had begun to hear rumors of what was happening inside. Some even witnessed the bodies being carted to nearby woods or mass graves. But Bergen-Belsen was guarded by fear as much as by fences. Those who asked questions were warned to keep quiet. Others simply chose not to see. Kramer's attitude during this period is perhaps best captured in the testimonies given after the war. When confronted with the scale of the suffering under his command, he did not deny it. Instead, he insisted that he had done everything possible, that the chaos was unavoidable, and that he had followed his orders. This defense, the cold logic of a bureaucrat of death, was echoed by others in the SS. It was not hatred that defined them, but obedience stripped of empathy. One document from early March showed that Kramer had written to his superiors requesting more supplies, but only after thousands had already died. By then, the camp was beyond saving. The guards themselves began to fall ill. The SS, now under threat from advancing Allied forces, had little interest in providing assistance. Bergen-Belsen had become a place of abandonment, not only for prisoners but for the system that created it. Still, transports continued to arrive. The death marches had not stopped. In fact, they had intensified. Every week brought more skeletal figures to the camp, people who had walked for days with no food, some carried by fellow prisoners on makeshift stretchers. Many died at the gate. Others crawled into barracks already filled to bursting. Kramer, it appears, saw no point in protest. He neither turned the transports away nor improved conditions to receive them. He remained at his post, as if the act of maintaining his position absolved him from the consequences of his inaction. In his world, duty was more important than morality. By the end of March, the camp's death toll had risen to tens of thousands. The crematoriums could not handle the bodies. The ground was too frozen for mass graves. Bergen-Belsen had become, in the words of one survivor, a landscape of the dead. This was not due to a lack of knowledge or foresight. It was a direct result of choices made by those in command, above all, Joseph Kramer. In the final weeks of the Second World War, the Nazi regime entered a phase of self-destruction, both militarily and morally. As Allied armies advanced from the west and the Soviet Red Army pushed in from the east, the leadership of the Third Reich remained consumed by a single obsession: the continued movement and containment of prisoners from its collapsing network of camps. Instead of surrendering or abandoning these sites, the SS ordered fresh evacuations. This decision triggered the last and most lethal wave of death marches, brutal, aimless treks through war-torn Europe, culminating in even greater misery at places like Bergen-Belsen. By March of 1945, the camp system was no longer functioning in any coherent way. Rail lines had been bombed, roads were clogged with retreating Wehrmacht units, and the countryside was flooded with refugees and displaced persons. Still, Nazi officials pressed on with their directives. Transports were no longer governed by strategy, they were dictated by ideology, by a refusal to let prisoners fall into enemy hands. Thousands were pulled from camps in northern Germany, western Poland, and even Austria, herded into columns and sent westward by foot. Some of the largest evacuations at this time came from Neuengamme, a forced labor camp near Hamburg. As British forces approached the region, SS leaders began dismantling Neuengamme's satellite camps. Between mid-March and early April, prisoners, many of them political dissidents, Soviet POWs and Jews, were marched toward Bergen-Belsen. These prisoners had already endured years of forced labor, malnutrition, and abuse. Now they faced a final ordeal with almost no prospect of survival. One survivor later described the experience as an endless line of ghosts. The marchers were no longer fully human in the eyes of their captors. They were weakened bodies in motion, barely clothed, many barefoot, moving only because to stop meant death. SS guards shot anyone who fell behind. Villagers along the route sometimes witnessed these killings in real time, but few intervened. The presence of death in the countryside had become disturbingly routine. The same pattern unfolded at Dora Mittelbau, a labor camp in central Germany where prisoners had been forced to manufacture V-2 rockets in underground tunnels. Conditions at Dora had been horrific even before evacuation. Prisoners worked in suffocating darkness with no fresh air and little food. When the camp was cleared in early April, roughly 40,000 inmates were dispersed across multiple routes, many of which led to Bergen-Belsen. The result was a tide of emaciated survivors pouring into an already overwhelmed camp. These marches were not coordinated in any systematic way. As command structures broke down, different SS units operated independently, making decisions on the ground. Some groups took direct routes, others wandered for days, rerouted by combat zones or lost due to confusion. Prisoners might be told they were heading to one camp, only to arrive at another entirely. For those marching, the only certainty was pain. Alongside Jews and political prisoners were members of various persecuted groups: Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and people with disabilities. Entire communities were destroyed in motion. In many cases, survivors were too weak to remember the names of those who died beside them. Burials were rare. Corpses were often left by the roadside, stripped of identification and forgotten within hours. The role of SS guards during these final marches remained consistent: maintain forward movement at all costs. However, as the war deteriorated, discipline within SS ranks began to falter. Some guards deserted their posts. Others engaged in drunken violence or used the marches as opportunities to loot or settle personal grievances. The breakdown of order did not lead to mercy. It resulted in further chaos and cruelty. A particularly disturbing feature of these late marches was the treatment of women. Female prisoners, many already suffering from starvation and disease, were subjected to beatings, sexual assault, and neglect. The breakdown of command structures meant that accountability vanished. In some columns, women were separated from men and forced to walk in smaller groups, guarded by male soldiers who viewed them not as prisoners, but as spoils. These abuses went largely unrecorded at the time, but surfaced years later in survivor testimonies. Some prisoners attempted escape during the confusion. Dense forests, spring storms, and nighttime darkness provided cover. A handful managed to find shelter with sympathetic villagers or underground resistance groups. Most escapees, however, were quickly recaptured or killed. For those too weak to flee, the only option was to keep walking and hope that liberation would come before death. The condition of prisoners arriving at Bergen-Belsen in late March and early April defied comprehension. Many were unable to stand. Others arrived crawling or were carried by fellow inmates. Eyewitnesses recalled that some prisoners died just steps from the camp gates. Those who did enter found no relief. The camp was already beyond breaking point. New arrivals were not registered or housed. They were left on the ground, exposed to cold, rain, and disease. Bergen-Belsen, by this stage, was a cesspool of suffering. Food rations had ceased almost entirely. Water supplies were contaminated. Latrines overflowed. Barracks, where they still existed, were packed far beyond capacity. Some inmates slept on corpses. Others fought over scraps of garbage. Cannibalism, though rare, was reported. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and starvation swept through the camp in waves. Medical care was virtually non-existent. The decision to continue the death marches even in the face of such conditions revealed the depth of Nazi ideological commitment. Bergen-Belsen had become not a place of refuge or transfer, but a final graveyard. It absorbed thousands of prisoners who had already survived the worst horrors of the Holocaust, only to meet their end in a camp without gas chambers or crematoria, only cold neglect. Among those who arrived during this time was the Hungarian Jewish diarist Eva Heyman, though she died before reaching the camp. Others, like Elie Wiesel, survived their marches and went on to bear witness in post-war accounts that gave the world its most vivid portraits of these final days. They spoke not only of suffering, but of numbness, the psychological detachment that allowed them to witness death without reaction, to walk past corpses without pause. Despite the hopelessness, acts of solidarity continued. Prisoners who had nothing left sometimes shared their last pieces of bread, or helped lift those who had fallen. In moments of darkness, fragments of dignity remained. On the morning of April 15, 1945, British forces crossed into the Bergen-Belsen Camp complex. What they discovered would forever alter the world's understanding of Nazi crimes. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen did not come with a battle or firefight. There were no tanks storming through fences, no shootout with desperate guards. What the soldiers found was something far more chilling, silence punctuated only by the groans of the dying and the buzzing of flies over the dead. The liberating force was a unit of the British Second Army, led by Major General Bernard Low Montgomery. Their initial objective was to secure the surrounding region near the town of Celle, but reports had reached command about a camp holding thousands of prisoners in appalling conditions. A ceasefire had been negotiated in the area to prevent the spread of typhus into the surrounding population, and British medical officers were authorized to enter Bergen-Belsen without resistance. Lieutenant Colonel Mervyn Gonin, one of the first British officers to walk through the camp gates, later described what he saw as beyond comprehension. The ground was littered with thousands of unburied corpses, some in heaps, some lying alone where they had fallen. Survivors wandered through the camp, too weak to speak or even look up. The stench of death was overwhelming. There was no sanitation, no food supply, no working infrastructure. Bergen-Belsen was not just a concentration camp. It had become a place where the entire fabric of human life had disintegrated. The camp held approximately 60,000 prisoners when the British arrived. Of those, more than 13,000 were already dead. Many more would die in the days and weeks that followed. Doctors who arrived with the troops attempted to establish a field hospital, but the conditions made even basic care difficult. There were no proper buildings, no supplies, and no running water. Every effort had to begin from nothing. What shocked the British soldiers most was not only the scale of death but the state of those who remained alive. Emaciated to the point of appearing skeletal, many prisoners could not stand. Their eyes were sunken, their skin hung loose, and some were so weak that they died within hours of liberation. Nurses and medical officers reported that many of the survivors were too far gone to respond to treatment. Food had to be reintroduced slowly to prevent refeeding syndrome, a condition where the body, after prolonged starvation, shuts down when reintroduced to normal sustenance too quickly. Some prisoners were delirious, mumbling incoherent words in a dozen languages. Others simply sat motionless, their minds detached from their surroundings. Children stared blankly at their liberators, unsure whether to feel fear or hope. In many cases, families had been separated for months or years, and some prisoners died without ever learning the fate of their loved ones. British troops acted quickly to take control of the camp. SS guards who had remained at the site were arrested immediately. Some were forced to help bury the dead under military supervision. Others were interrogated. Among them was Joseph Kramer, the camp commandant, who was captured without resistance. Kramer showed no emotion as he was led away. When asked about the state of the camp, he claimed he had done everything possible to maintain order under difficult circumstances. Within days, British engineers and medical personnel began working to contain the crisis. Bulldozers were brought in to dig mass graves. Though the idea of using machines to move human remains felt inhumane, it was the only practical way to deal with the sheer number of corpses and prevent further disease. British soldiers, many of whom had fought in North Africa and Normandy, were seen weeping or vomiting. None had encountered anything like Bergen-Belsen. The British Army documented everything. Photographers and journalists were brought in to bear witness. One of the most significant figures in this effort was Richard Dimbleby, a BBC correspondent who entered the camp within days of liberation. His radio broadcast described the scenes in graphic, unflinching detail. Dimbleby spoke of the piles of bodies, the starving survivors, the unbearable stench. The BBC initially refused to air his report, believing it too horrific for public broadcast. Dimbleby threatened to resign unless it was released in full. Eventually, it was broadcast, and the world heard for the first time an eyewitness account of Nazi mass murder in the heart of Germany. This was the beginning of a new chapter in the war, not one of battles and strategy, but of evidence, testimony, and accountability. Film footage shot by the British Army was later used in war crimes trials. It showed bodies being hauled by bulldozers, mass graves being filled, and survivors receiving medical aid. These images shocked the Allied public and forced many in Germany to confront the reality of what had happened within their own borders. In the weeks that followed, the British set up displaced persons camps nearby to house survivors. Efforts were made to identify the dead, though many could not be named. Jewish survivors, Roma, political prisoners and other detainees were given food, clothing and medical care. Still, the death toll continued to rise. Despite the best efforts of medical teams, more than 13,000 additional inmates died after liberation due to starvation, disease, or complications from prolonged abuse. Among the survivors were people who would later become prominent voices in Holocaust remembrance. Some went on to testify at trials. Others wrote memoirs or participated in oral history projects. For them, Bergen-Belsen was not just the site of suffering, but the place where the world finally saw what the Nazi regime had done. What made Bergen-Belsen's liberation especially powerful was its location. This was not a hidden camp in the far reaches of Eastern Europe. It was in Germany, just kilometers from towns where civilians lived normal lives. The juxtaposition between the ordinary and the unthinkable forced a moral reckoning. British soldiers questioned how such atrocities could happen in a country that had once prided itself on culture, science, and discipline. The liberation also became a turning point in international responses to the Holocaust. Until then, many in the West had struggled to grasp the full scale of Nazi atrocities. Reports from Eastern Europe were often dismissed as exaggerated or unreliable. Bergen-Belsen provided undeniable proof. The footage, photographs, and testimonies made it impossible to look away. After securing the camp, British authorities demolished much of the original site. The remaining prisoners were moved to nearby military hospitals or displaced persons camps. Efforts were made to disinfect the area and prevent further spread of typhus. Bergen-Belsen was declared closed by the summer of 1945, but the memory remained. For the soldiers who liberated the camp, the images never faded. For the survivors, liberation was both a beginning and an end. The end of physical captivity, but the beginning of lifelong trauma. The world, having seen Bergen-Belsen, could no longer claim ignorance. In the aftermath of liberation, the British Army confronted not only a humanitarian catastrophe, but also a legal and moral imperative. Those responsible for the horrors of Bergen-Belsen had to be held to account. The death, degradation, and systemic cruelty uncovered at the camp demanded more than documentation. They required justice. What followed was one of the earliest and most publicized war crimes trials of the post-war era, the Belsen trial. Held in the city of Lüneburg in northern Germany, the trial began in September of 1945, just 5 months after British troops had liberated Bergen-Belsen. It was one of the first trials conducted under Allied authority and served as a precursor to the more widely known Nuremberg trials that would begin later that year. Officially known as the trial of Joseph Kramer and 44 others, it placed some of the most notorious figures of Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz on trial together. The decision to prosecute both Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz staff in the same proceeding reflected the chaotic nature of the final phase of the war. Many SS personnel had served at multiple camps, often transferring from one to another in rapid succession. Josef Kramer, for example, had previously held command at Auschwitz before arriving at Bergen-Belsen. Irma Gräser, one of the most infamous female guards, had also worked at both camps. This overlap allowed the prosecution to present a wider picture of Nazi crimes, connecting different sites of atrocity within a single trial framework. The courtroom was a converted military barracks. It was modest in size, yet its proceedings would capture global attention. Journalists, legal scholars, and observers from numerous Allied nations attended. The British military legal system led the prosecution, with Colonel T.M. Backhouse as the chief prosecutor. The defence was provided by British-appointed counsel, ensuring a fair trial by international standards. 45 defendants stood in the dock, 20 men and 25 women. Among them were SS officers, guards, medical personnel, and kapos, prisoner functionaries accused of abusing fellow inmates. Joseph Kramer sat prominently at the front, his demeanour cold and composed. Irma Gräser, then only in her early 20s, became a focus of media fascination due to her youth and reputation for violence. The charges were not for conventional battlefield crimes. The prosecution accused the defendants of war crimes, specifically the murder, ill treatment, and neglect of Allied nationals held in concentration camps. Because many victims were from occupied nations such as France, the Netherlands, and Belgium, their deaths were treated as violations of international law, regardless of their Jewish identity. This approach allowed the court to sidestep the challenge of defining genocide, a legal concept still in its infancy. The prosecution relied heavily on survivor testimony. Dozens of witnesses, many of whom were still recovering from illness and starvation, traveled to Lüneburg to recount what they had endured. Their stories were harrowing. One survivor described watching friends collapse from hunger, only to be beaten for not standing during roll call. Another told of carrying the dead out of the barracks each morning, unable to bury them, forced to live among their rotting remains. These testimonies provided vivid insight into the day-to-day brutality of camp life. They described routine beatings, sexual abuse, deliberate starvation, and medical neglect. Several witnesses singled out specific guards, including Irma Gräser, for extreme cruelty. One woman testified that Gräser had personally whipped prisoners until their skins split open, laughing as she did so. Others spoke of Kramer's indifference. describing how he calmly walked past piles of corpses without reacting. Photographic and film evidence taken during and after the liberation of Bergen-Belsen was also presented. Images of emaciated bodies, mass graves, and overcrowded barracks were shown in court. These visual records made a powerful impact. Unlike earlier wartime reports, which some had dismissed as propaganda, these photographs were taken by Allied troops and carried the weight of official documentation. They left little room for denial. The defendants responded to the charges in various ways. Joseph Kramer claimed he had been overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. He argued that he lacked the resources to prevent the catastrophe at Bergen-Belsen and had merely followed orders from superiors. Irma Gräser offered little defense beyond stating that she had carried out her duties as instructed. Others denied direct involvement or claimed ignorance, insisting they were unaware of the worst atrocities. The judges, all British officers, considered both the evidence and the legal novelty of the trial. War crimes law at the time was still evolving. The Geneva Conventions covered the treatment of prisoners of war, but had not anticipated the systematic mass murder of civilians. Nevertheless, the court ruled that the treatment of prisoners at Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz constituted crimes against humanity. In November of 1945, the verdicts were announced. 11 defendants, including Josef Kramer and Irma Gräser, were sentenced to death. Others received varying prison sentences. A handful were acquitted due to lack of evidence. On December 13, 1945, Josef Kramer was hanged at Hamelin prison, along with 10 of his co-defendants. Irma Gräser became one of the youngest women executed under British military law. The Belsen trial was significant not only for its outcome but for what it revealed about the inner workings of the Nazi camp system. It showed that atrocities were not isolated acts of madness but part of a structured bureaucratic process carried out by individuals who often claimed to be just doing their jobs. The trial also emphasized the importance of eyewitness accounts, which became central to the emerging field of Holocaust historiography. For survivors, the trial was both a validation and a burden. Many felt that justice had been served, yet others struggled with the limits of what could be prosecuted. Thousands of guards and administrators had participated in the Holocaust, but only a fraction were ever tried. Moreover, the trauma of testifying reopened wounds that some had hoped to leave behind. Public reaction to the trial varied. In Britain and the United States, coverage focused heavily on the shocking details of camp life and the youth of some defendants. In Germany, reactions were more complicated. While many Germans expressed horror at the evidence, others resisted acknowledging the full extent of their nation's crimes. Some argued that the trials were examples of victor's justice. Others simply refused to believe the reports. Still, the Belsen trial set a precedent. It demonstrated that perpetrators of mass atrocity could be held accountable under international law. It paved the way for future trials, including those at Nuremberg, and decades later, those addressing genocide in Rwanda, Yugoslavia, and elsewhere. It also helped to establish the principle that following orders was not a defense for inhumanity. Importantly, the trial helped preserve memory. The documentation gathered during the proceedings, transcripts, photographs, testimonies, became a foundation for future education and commemoration. Survivors, historians, and educators would use these materials to ensure that what happened at Bergen-Belsen and on the death marches that preceded it would not be forgotten. Yet memory alone cannot ensure understanding. That burden falls to each generation that follows. The final section of this documentary will explore how the death marches, Bergen-Belsen, and the testimonies of those who survived continue to shape our understanding of history, morality, and the responsibilities we carry in the face of inhumanity.